The September sun hung low over Arizona territory, casting long shadows across the desert floor as a weathered wagon creaked to a halt before what remained of the Callaway Ranch. The wooden wheels groaned their final protest, settling into dust that had not been disturbed in 2 years. Silence fell, broken only by the whisper of wind through broken windows and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. From the wagon stepped a woman who belonged to two worlds and neither. Kai Neshoba moved with deliberate grace, her boots finding purchase on ground that had once been swept clean each morning. She wore the long skirt and simple blouse of a settler's wife, her dark hair bound in a practical bun, but no amount of fabric could disguise what her skin and eyes proclaimed. She was Apache. She was unwelcome. She was home. The ranch house stood like a skeleton against the fading light. Bullet holes pocked the adobe walls, relics of some forgotten violence. The porch sagged where termites had feasted undisturbed. Weeds grew tall where Daniel had once planted vegetables back when hope had seemed less foolish. Kai stood motionless, absorbing the decay, her face revealing nothing of the grief that moved like cold water through her chest. She was 32 years old. She had survived a cavalry raid that killed her family. She had survived the Indian school that tried to kill her spirit. She had survived marriage to a white man in a territory that despised such unions. She had survived becoming a widow. One more survival, she told herself, was not too much to ask. The door hung loose on its hinges. She pushed it open with one hand, the other resting instinctively near the knife hidden in the folds of her skirt. Old habits from an older life. The interior smelled of dust and mouse droppings and time. Furniture lay overturned. Someone had been here looking for something worth stealing. They had found little. Daniel had never been a man who accumulated possessions. In the corner beneath a coating of grime stood a frame. Kai crossed the room and lifted it, her thumb wiping away years to reveal the faces beneath. A younger version of herself stood beside a man in a worn cavalry uniform. Daniel Callaway. His smile reached his eyes in that photograph taken on a rare day when the weight of what they both carried had seemed lighter. She studied his face as if it might speak, might explain why he had left her this burden. A sound from outside. Not wind, not animal. Human movement, deliberate and cautious. Kai set down the photograph and moved to the window, her body instinctively seeking the shadows. Through the cracked glass, she saw him. A boy, perhaps 14, thin as a coyote in winter, emerging from the barn with the hesitant steps of one accustomed to being unwanted. His clothes hung loose on his frame. Mexican, she thought, from the set of his features and the darkness of his hair. She watched him approach the well, lower the bucket, drink deeply. He moved like someone who had been thirsty for a very long time. When he finished, he looked toward the house, and for a moment their eyes met through the broken window. Fear crossed his face, the look of prey that knows it has been seen. Kai opened the door and stepped onto the porch. The boy froze, calculating distances, escape routes. She had seen that calculation before in her own reflection during those early days at the Indian school. "How long have you been here?" she asked. Her voice, unused to English after weeks of silence, came out rougher than intended. The boy said nothing, muscles tensed for flight. "I asked how long you have been here." Kai repeated, softer this time. "I am not telling you to leave." 6 months, Senora." The words came reluctantly in accented English. "I did not steal nothing, just the water. And sometimes I catch rabbits." "What is your name?" "Miguel. Miguel Reyes. I am Kai Callaway. This is my land." She paused, watching him process this information. "Do you know how to care for horses?" "Miguel Reyes." Confusion replaced fear on his young face. "See, yes. My father, he had horses. Before." "Before what?" The boy's eyes dropped. "Before he sold me to pay his debts." Kai felt something twist in her chest, an old wound responding to the echo of another's pain. She knew what it meant to be treated as property, to have your humanity negotiated away by those who should have protected you. "I need someone who knows horses," she said. "You will stay. You will work. I will pay you." The boy looked at her with the wariness of one who has learned that kindness usually carries a price. Why? Because I need help. Because you are already here. Because... She paused, searching for words in a language that had never felt entirely her own, because everyone deserves a place to stand. For a long moment they regarded each other across the dusty yard, two people shaped by abandonment, considering the possibility of something other than solitude. "There is a room in the barn," Kai finally said. "Clean it. Make it yours." As the boy hurried away, relief and disbelief mingling on his face, Kai turned back to the house. So much to repair. So much broken that could not be fixed. But that was for tomorrow. Tonight she would sleep in the house Daniel had built, surrounded by his ghost and her memories, and the question of why he had chosen this particular piece of earth to call theirs. The sun had nearly set when the riders came. Kai heard them before she saw them, the thunder of hooves announcing visitors who did not care about being heard. She moved to the porch, her hand finding the Winchester rifle she had propped beside the door. Old instincts rising like muscle memory. 6 men on horseback emerged from the golden haze of dust and dying light. They rode with the easy confidence of those accustomed to being obeyed. The man in front wore a vest that cost more than most families earned in a year. His face had the hardness of desert stone, weathered and unyielding. They stopped 10 feet from the porch, close enough to intimidate, far enough to claim civility. "Mrs. Calloway," the man in the vest said, removing his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "Victor Blackwood, Arizona Mining Company. I heard you had returned to us." Kai said nothing, her eyes moving across each man, cataloging weapons, reading postures, calculating threat levels, as Daniel had taught her during those long evenings when he had refused to let her be defenseless. "I knew your husband," Blackwood continued when she did not respond. "Fine man, shame about what happened. Apache raiders, they said. Ironic, given your heritage." "My husband died of fever," Kai said, her voice flat and hard. "Not raiders." Blackwood's smile did not reach his eyes. "Of course, forgive me. I must have heard wrong." He replaced his hat, the gesture somehow threatening. "I have come with a business proposition. This land, it is not easy for a woman alone, especially a woman of your particular circumstances. I am prepared to offer $500 for the property, more than fair for a ranch that has seen better days." "No." The single word fell between them like a stone into still water. "I beg your pardon. I said no." "This land is not for sale." Blackwood's face tightened, the mask of civility slipping just enough to reveal the calculation beneath. "Mrs. Calloway, I do not think you understand the situation. A woman alone of Indian blood trying to maintain a property in territory that does not look kindly on such arrangements. There are dangers, outlaws, hostile natives. Accidents happen." Kai's hand shifted on the rifle, a movement so slight it could have been imagination, but every man tensed in response. She had not raised it, had not aimed it, but the promise of violence hung in the air like electricity before a storm. "I understand perfectly, Mr. Blackwood," Kai said, her voice carrying the same quiet finality as a closing door. "I am the widow of cavalry officer Daniel Calloway. This land is legally mine through marriage, documented and registered with the territorial government. If you wish to dispute that, speak with a lawyer." "The law," Blackwood said softly, "does not always protect those who are vulnerable." "Then it is fortunate," Kai replied, her dark eyes meeting his without blinking, "that I have never relied on the law for protection." The silence that followed carried weight. Somewhere in the distance a coyote called to the rising moon. One of Blackwood's men shifted in his saddle, leather creaking. Finally Blackwood smiled, but it was the smile of a man making calculations, adjusting strategies. "You are either very brave or very foolish, Mrs. Calloway. I have not yet decided which. I will give you time to reconsider, but understand this." He leaned forward slightly. "I am a patient man, but I am not a man accustomed to being refused. Think carefully about what you truly want from this situation." He wheeled his horse around his men, following suit. They rode away in the same formation they had arrived, leaving only dust and the echo of hoofbeats and a threat that hung in the air like smoke. Miguel emerged from the barn where he had been hiding. "Who was that trouble?" Kai said simply. "Will he come back?" "Yes." The boy looked at her, waiting for more, but she had already turned and entered the house. Some questions had answers that changed nothing. Inside in the fading light, Kai moved through rooms that had once held laughter. She found what she was looking for in the corner of what had been their bedroom. A wooden chest, plain and functional, Daniel's initials carved into the lid. She had not opened it since his death, had not trusted herself with the weight of what it might contain. The hinges protested as she lifted the lid. Inside, carefully wrapped in oiled cloth, lay a Winchester rifle. Not new, but well-maintained, the stock worn smooth by years of use. Beside it, a leather pouch containing ammunition, each bullet meticulously cleaned and ordered. And beneath that, a letter sealed with wax, her name written in Daniel's careful hand. Kai lifted the letter with trembling fingers. The wax broke easily, as if it had been waiting for this moment. She unfolded the paper and read by the last light of day. "Kai," it began, "if you are reading this, I am gone, and you are facing what I feared most." Her eyes moved down the page, absorbing words written by a dead man who had known more than he revealed. "This land is not random. I chose it because I knew from old cavalry maps and whispered stories among the older soldiers that there is something beneath it. Something the Apache called Tse Li Chi, starstone. The old-timers said it glows in darkness, said it is worth more than silver, more than gold." Kai's breath caught. She looked at the chest again, seeing it differently now. "I never told you because I wanted you to have a choice. Sell it and live safely, or stay and fight for what is yours by blood and by right. Whatever you choose, know this. You are not the helpless girl I found in that fire 23 years ago. You never were." The letter continued, but Kai's eyes had stopped on a single line. "The rifle in this chest was your father's. I kept it for you." Slowly, reverently, she lifted the Winchester again, turned it in the dying light, saw carved into the stock in symbols she had not been allowed to speak of for 2 decades, her father's name in Apache, Nietzsche. Strength. This was not just a rifle. This was inheritance. This was legacy. This was the weapon of a man who had died defending his family while cavalry soldiers burned their home and scattered his people like seeds in a bitter wind. And Daniel had kept it, all these years, waiting for the moment when she would need to remember who she had been before the Indian school tried to erase her. Before she had learned to speak English without accent, to dress like white women, to lower her eyes and accept that her people were called savages by those who had taken everything. Kai sat on the floor of the empty house holding her father's rifle, and for the first time since Daniel's death, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of what she carried. Not just grief, not just loss, but rage, clean and bright and sustaining. They wanted her land, they wanted her gone. They wanted her to disappear like her people were supposed to disappear into reservations and boarding schools and the quiet erasure that came from being perpetually unwelcome in the land of your ancestors. But Kai Neshoba had survived too much to disappear now. Outside, night fell over the Arizona desert. Stars emerged, the same stars that had guided her people for generations beyond counting. Somewhere in the darkness, Miguel Reyes lay in the barn, perhaps the first real sleep he had known in months. Somewhere beyond the hills, Victor Blackwood was making plans, calculating how to break a woman he thought weak. He did not know that weakness and silence were not the same thing. He did not know that she had spent 20 years learning the language and laws and ways of those who had destroyed her family, not to become one of them, but to survive long enough to reclaim what they had stolen. He did not know that beneath the careful English and the settler's clothing and the widow's grief, she was still Apache, still the daughter of Nietzsche, still capable of the same fierce protection that had cost her father his life. They would learn. Kai loaded the Winchester with practiced efficiency, each bullet sliding into place with a soft click of certainty. Then she placed it beside the door where she could reach it quickly. Tomorrow she would begin repairs. Tomorrow she would learn what Blackwood truly wanted. Tomorrow she would start the work of transforming this ruin back into a home. But tonight she sat in darkness with her father's rifle and her husband's letter, and the certain knowledge that the war she had thought ended 23 years ago had merely been waiting for her to be ready to fight it. The moon rose full and bright over Coyote Springs, casting silver light across the desert. In that light, if one knew how to look, the land itself seemed to glow as if something beneath the earth was responding to the celestial presence above. Starstone, the old ones had called it. Sacred, powerful, worth killing for if you believed in such things. Kai did not yet know what lay beneath her land, did not yet understand why Blackwood wanted it so desperately, did not yet grasp the full scope of what Daniel had left her. But she would learn. And when she did, she would make choices not as the frightened child saved from fire, not as the Indian school student forced to forget her language, not even as the cavalry officer's widow. She would choose as Kai Neshoba, Apache, survivor, warrior, and that would make all the difference. Morning came to the Arizona desert the way it always did, sudden and unforgiving. One moment the world existed in shades of gray and shadow, the next the sun crested the eastern mountains and set everything ablaze with light so fierce it hurt to breathe. Kai stood on the porch of the ranch house watching the transformation, a cup of weak coffee cooling in her hands. She had not slept. Sleep was a luxury she could not afford, not until she understood the shape of the threat facing her. Instead, she had spent the night cataloging everything the ranch possessed. 3 horses in various states of neglect, tools rusted but salvageable, a well that still produced clean water, fence lines that needed mending across 200 acres of land that looked worthless to anyone who did not know what lay beneath. Miguel emerged from the barn, moving with the cautious energy of someone unaccustomed to safety. He had cleaned himself at the well, his hair still damp, his clothes the same threadbare garments, but somehow more dignified in the morning light. "Señora," he said, uncertain of the protocol, "what would you have me do today?" Kai considered him. 14 years old and already carrying the weight of a much older man, she recognized that burden had carried a version of it herself. "Can you ride?" she asked. "Yes, señora." "Then saddle 2 horses. We are going to town." The boy's eyes widened slightly. "Town? But if someone sees me, if they ask questions about who I am, where I came from—" "Then you will tell them you work for me," Kai said simply. "And anyone who questions that will answer to me." Coyote Springs sat in a shallow valley 20 minutes' ride from the ranch, a collection of wooden buildings arranged along a single dirt street with the optimistic grandiosity common to settlements that believed they would someday become cities. They would not. Kai had seen enough of Arizona territory to know that some places were destined to remain exactly what they were, way stations between somewhere and nowhere. The general store stood at the center of town, a 2-story structure that also served as the post office and informal gathering place for those who had business or simply time to waste. As Kai and Miguel approached, she felt eyes tracking their movement. Conversations halted mid-sentence. A woman pulled her child closer, as if Indian blood might be contagious. Kai dismounted with deliberate slowness, giving them time to look to Judge to remember that she had every right to be here whether they approved or not. She tied her horse to the rail and turned to Miguel. "Wait here," she said. Inside the store smelled of coffee and leather and the particular mustiness that came from goods sitting too long in desert heat. Behind the counter stood a woman whose age was difficult to determine, somewhere between 40 and 60, with the kind of face that had seen too much to be easily surprised. "Mrs. Calloway," the woman said, her voice carrying a warmth that did not match the wariness in the eyes of the other customers. "I heard you had come back to us." "Elena," Kai acknowledged. She had met Elena Morales only a few times during her brief marriage to Daniel, but the woman had never treated her with the contempt most townspeople barely bothered to conceal. "I need supplies. Flour, sugar, coffee. Whatever you can spare on credit until I can pay." Elena nodded, already moving to gather items. "Your husband was a good man. Credit is no problem." She paused, lowering her voice. I was sorry to hear about his passing. Fever is a hard way to go. Yes, Kai said, because there was nothing else to say about death that had not already been said 1,000 times before. As Elena worked filling a burlap sack with essentials, she spoke quietly, her words meant for Kai alone. I heard Victor Blackwood came to see you yesterday. News travels quickly. In a town this size, everything travels quickly. Elena tied the sack closed and set it on the counter. Kai, you should know something about Blackwood. He is not just a businessman. 15 years ago, he was a prospector, small-time desperate. He found something in Apache territory, or thought he did. When he tried to claim it, your people defended what was theirs. Most of his men died in the fighting. Kai felt something cold settle in her stomach. And Blackwood survived. Came back to civilization raving about rocks that glowed in darkness, about wealth beyond imagining buried in land the Apache refused to let anyone touch. Elena leaned forward. People thought him mad, but he built a mining company from nothing, became successful elsewhere, and he never forgot what he believed was stolen from him. My land, Kai said slowly, is in that same territory. Your land is exactly where he thinks his fortune lies. Elena's expression carried genuine concern. Be careful. Blackwood is patient, but he is also ruthless. He has waited 15 years. He will not let a widow, especially an Apache widow, stand in his way now. Kai picked up the sack of supplies. Then he will learn that some widows are harder to move than others. Outside she found Miguel exactly where she had left him, but he was not alone. 3 men surrounded the boy, their postures aggressive, their voices carrying the particular ugliness that came from those who needed someone weaker to feel strong. "Where you from, boy?" one of them demanded. "You got papers, proof you are not some runaway Mexican." Miguel said nothing, his eyes fixed on the ground, his body language screaming submission in the hope that submission might equal safety. It would not. Kai knew from experience that predators did not respect surrender. They fed on it. She crossed the street in 5 long strides, her boots kicking up dust, the sack of supplies held easily in one hand. The men did not notice her until she was directly beside them. "He is with me," Kai said, her voice carrying clearly in the sudden quiet that had fallen over the street. The men turned. The one who had been speaking, a rancher named Hutchins, if she remembered correctly, looked her up and down with barely concealed contempt. "This boy yours, squaw." The word hung in the air like a curse. Around them, people had stopped to watch, drawn by the promise of confrontation. Kai met Hutchins' eyes without blinking. "His name is Miguel Reyes. He works for me. And my name is Mrs. Calloway. You will use it." Hutchins laughed, a sound without humor. "You think because you married a white man you are entitled to respect? You think a piece of paper changes what you are?" "I think," Kai said, her voice dropping to something quiet and dangerous, "that the law says this boy is under my protection. And I think you should step away from him before you discover what that protection means." For a long moment violence trembled in the air between them, a thing almost alive waiting to be born. Kai did not move, did not reach for the knife hidden in her skirt, did not need to. Sometimes the promise of violence was enough. Hutchins spat in the dust near her feet. "This territory is changing, Indian. The old ways are dying. You would be wise to remember that." "The old ways," Kai replied softly, "have survived worse than you." The men backed away, their pride demanding some show of defiance, even as their instincts warned them against pushing further. As they retreated, Kai heard one of them mutter something about uppity Indians and the natural order of things, but she had heard such words before. They held no power over her. "Come," she said to Miguel, "we have more to do." They rode to the northern edge of town to a ranch that sprawled across good grazing land with water access that made it valuable in a territory where water meant survival. The Wilson Ranch had been there for 2 generations, built by men who believed that hard work and harder fists could carve civilization from wilderness. Jack Wilson stood in his corral, a man in his middle 50s, whose body still carried the strength of his younger years, even as his face showed the weathering of decades under desert sun. He looked up as Kai approached, and his expression closed like a door slamming shut. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, the title forced from him by habit rather than respect. "What brings you to my property?" "Water rights," Kai said simply. "The creek that runs through your land also flows through mine. I wanted to ensure we understand the boundaries." Wilson's jaw tightened. "I do not conduct business with Indians." "You conducted business with my husband." "Your husband was a white man, a cavalry officer, a man who understood the natural order of things." Wilson gestured dismissively. "You are a squaw who got lucky enough to marry above your station. That does not make you his equal." Kai felt the familiar weight of rage, but she had learned long ago that rage was useful only when controlled, when aimed with precision. She kept her voice level. "The law does not care about your opinions, Mr. Wilson. The creek divides our properties equally. I am not asking for your approval. I am informing you of the facts." "Facts." Wilson stepped closer, his posture threatening. "The fact is that you have no business owning land. The fact is that a woman alone, especially an Indian woman, cannot maintain a ranch. The fact is that you will fail, and when you do that, land will go to someone who deserves it." Before Kai could respond, a young woman emerged from the ranch house. She moved with the confidence of someone used to being heard. Her blonde hair pulled back in a practical braid, her dress simple but well made. "Father," she said, her voice carrying disapproval, "you are being rude. Sarah, go back inside. This does not concern you." The girl, who Kai guessed to be around 18, ignored the command. She walked directly to Kai and extended her hand. "I am Sarah Wilson. I apologize for my father's behavior. He forgets sometimes that manners exist for everyone, not just those he deems worthy." Kai took the offered hand, surprised by the firm grip, the direct eye contact. "Kai Calloway." "I know who you are," Sarah said. "Your husband helped my father 3 years ago when renegade Apache raided our cattle. He could have let my father handle it alone, could have claimed it was not his problem, but he rode with our men and helped drive them off. My father seems to have forgotten that debt." Wilson's face reddened. "That was different. That was cavalry business." "That was kindness," Sarah corrected. "Something we seem to be short on these days." She turned back to Kai. "The creek belongs to both properties equally. My father knows this. He is simply testing to see if you will defend what is yours." Kai studied the girl with new interest. Intelligence shone in those eyes, and something else. A kind of hunger for something beyond the narrow confines of what this territory offered women, regardless of their color. "Thank you," Kai said, "for the clarification." As she rode away, Miguel spoke for the first time since the confrontation in town. "Why did she help you?" "I do not know," Kai admitted. "Perhaps because fairness matters to her. Perhaps because she is tired of watching her father be cruel. Perhaps because she sees something in our situation that reminds her of her own." "What do you mean?" Kai glanced back at the ranch house where Sarah stood watching them leave. "She is trapped too in her way. Different cage, same captivity." They returned to town for one final stop. The telegraph office occupied a corner of the post office, a small room with a single clerk who looked up from his desk with barely concealed irritation at being disturbed. "I need to send a message," Kai said. The clerk, a thin man with ink-stained fingers, raised an eyebrow. "You got money?" Kai placed coins on the counter more than necessary. "To Santa Fe, Bureau of Indian Affairs." The clerk's expression shifted from irritation to suspicion. "What business does an Indian have with the Bureau?" "That is between me and them," Kai said evenly. "Are you refusing to send a paid telegram?" The clerk scowled but pulled out a message form. "What do you want it to say?" Kai dictated, slowly watching to ensure he wrote every word correctly. "Request verification of land deed for Calloway Ranch, Coyote Springs, Arizona Territory. Request legal standing of Apache widow under current territorial law. Signed, Kai Nashoba Calloway." Before leaving town, Kai made one final purchase at the general store. A box camera, simple but functional, the kind traveling photographers used. Elena raised an eyebrow at the expense. Documentation, Kai explained simply. If we are going to fight them, we need evidence that cannot be dismissed. Elena wrapped the camera carefully. Smart. Words can be denied. Photographs cannot. As they rode back to the ranch in the late afternoon heat, Miguel finally asked the question that had clearly been troubling him. Senora, why do you stay? If they hate you, if they want your land, why not just sell and go somewhere else? Kai was quiet for a long time, watching the desert pass by the endless expanse of rock and sand and sky that most people saw as empty, but which held stories in every shadow memory, in every stone. Because this land belonged to my people, before it belonged to anyone with paper that said otherwise, she finally said. Because my husband bought it knowing what it was, knowing what it meant, and left it to me as a gift and a burden. Because running away does not stop people like Blackwood. It only teaches them that threats work. But are you not afraid? Kai looked at the boy, saw in his young face the same fear she had carried at that age, the same uncertainty about whether survival was worth the cost. I am terrified, she said honestly, every moment of every day. But I learned long ago that being afraid does not mean you cannot act. Sometimes the bravest thing is doing what terrifies you anyway. That night, after Miguel had gone to sleep in the barn after the desert had cooled and the stars had emerged in their thousands, Kai sat on the porch with her father's rifle across her knees. In the distance, a coyote sang to the moon, its voice lonely and defiant. She heard the rider before she saw him, the slow, deliberate approach of someone who wanted to be heard. Her hand tightened on the Winchester, but she did not raise it. Not yet. The horse and rider materialized from the darkness, resolving into an old man whose posture in the saddle spoke of a lifetime spent on horseback. He stopped at the edge of the porch, and in the moonlight Kai saw his face. Apache. Old, perhaps 75 or more, his hair white as winter, his face a map of years that had not been kind. He spoke in the language she had not heard in 20 years, the words falling on her ears like rain on drought-parched earth. Hagone, daughter of Naiche, the Apache language forbidden in the Indian school, beaten out of children who dared speak it, came back to her slowly, rusty but still present. Who are you? The old man dismounted with care, moving like someone whose bones remembered injuries long healed but never forgotten. I am Thomas Neshoba, brother of your father, your uncle. Kai felt the world tilt slightly. She had thought all her family dead, scattered to reservations or graves erased by the great machinery of manifest destiny that ground people into history. My father had no brother, she said, but even as she spoke she knew it was a lie children tell themselves about a past they were too young to remember clearly. Your father had 3 brothers, Thomas said gently. 2 died in the fighting. I survived by being elsewhere when the cavalry came. He stepped closer into the light spilling from the open door. I heard you had returned. I came to see if it was true, if the girl who was taken so long ago had found her way home. Kai stared at this apparition from a past she had tried to bury beneath English words and settler clothes and the careful construction of a life that did not invite questions. Why now? Why come now after all these years? Because the land remembers even when we forget, Thomas said. Because Blackwood is not just a greedy white man. He is the man who killed many of our people 15 years ago when they tried to defend Tse Nanyai Bahi, the place where the moon touches earth, the sacred ground where our ancestors rest. The canyon, Kai said, understanding dawning. The canyon south of here. Thomas nodded. Your husband knew. He bought this land because he understood it should belong to you, to us, not to men who see only profit in what is sacred. From within his coat he drew something and held it out to her, a small object that caught the moonlight and seemed to hold it glowing faintly in his weathered palm. Tse Lichii, he said. Starstone. It fell from the sky long before white men came to this land. Our people buried it with our honored dead, believing it would light their way in the world beyond. Blackwood wants to dig it up and sell it. He does not know what it is, only that it is valuable." Kai took the stone, felt its strange warmth, saw how it pulsed with soft luminescence. Daniel mentioned this in his letter. He called it worth more than gold. "It is worth more than all the gold in all the world," Thomas said, "because it is the memory of our people made solid. It is the proof that we were here, that we honored our dead, that we believed in something beyond survival." He paused. "Blackwood will kill for it. He has killed for it before." The night suddenly felt colder. Kai closed her fist around the glowing stone. "Then he will have to kill me too." Thomas smiled, an expression of profound sadness mixed with pride. "You are your father's daughter." He said those same words before they shot him. They sat together on the porch, uncle and niece reunited by necessity and threat, and Thomas told her stories. About her father Nietzsche, who had been a warrior when being a warrior still meant something. About her mother, who had woven dream catchers to protect her children and had died with one clutched in her hands. About the family that had been scattered like seeds in a fire, some finding purchase in new soil, most dying where they fell. As dawn approached, Thomas reached into his saddlebag and withdrew something wrapped in soft leather. He unfolded it carefully, revealing a dream catcher, its webbing intact despite the passage of years, strands of dark hair woven into its design. "Your mother made this," he said, pressing it into Kai's hands. "Before she died, she told me that if her daughter ever came home, I should give it to her, so she would remember who she was." Kai held the dream catcher, and for the first time since Daniel's death, tears came. Not the quiet tears of private grief, but the kind that shook her whole body, that carried sounds she did not know she could make. Thomas sat beside her, saying nothing, his presence the only comfort he could offer. When the storm passed, when Kai could breathe again, she looked at her uncle with eyes that had changed. "Teach me," she said. "Teach me everything they tried to make me forget. The language, the stories, the names of my ancestors. If I am going to fight for this land, I need to know what I am fighting for." Thomas nodded slowly. "Knowledge is a weapon they cannot take from you. We will begin tomorrow." As the old man rode away into the breaking dawn, Kai hung the dream catcher above the door of the ranch house. It turned slowly in the morning breeze, catching light, casting shadows, a bridge between who she had been forced to become and who she had always been underneath. Miguel emerged from the barn, saw the dream catcher, said nothing. Some things did not need explanation. "Today we mend fences," Kai told him. "Tomorrow we prepare for war." The boy nodded, understanding that sometimes the two were the same thing. The sun had not yet cleared the mountains when Kai, Thomas, Miguel, and a fourth rider set out toward the canyon lands south of the ranch. The fourth rider was a surprise that had arrived at dawn, appearing like a ghost from the morning mist. Chato was perhaps 10 years old, though malnutrition made precise age difficult to determine. Miguel had found him collapsed near the creek 2 days prior, his leg bearing a wound that spoke of violence rather than accident. The boy had said nothing at first, fear rendering him mute, but gradually his story had emerged in fragments of Apache mixed with broken Spanish. His father had been killed. Not by cavalry, though that would have been the expected story, the familiar narrative of Apache versus soldier that everyone understood. No. Chato's father had been shot by men in civilian clothes, men with mining equipment who had been digging in places the old ones said should never be disturbed. Now Chato rode behind Thomas, his thin arms wrapped around the old man's waist, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon with the hypervigilance of prey that knows predators are everywhere. They moved carefully through terrain that grew increasingly rugged as they traveled south. The desert here was different from the flat expanses near the ranch, broken by arroyos and outcroppings of red rock that thrust from the earth like the bones of some ancient creature. Juniper and pinyon pine clung to life in impossible places, twisted by wind into shapes that suggested suffering made permanent. Thomas led them along paths that seemed to exist only in his memory, routes that avoided open ground and kept them hidden from casual observation. He moved with the certainty of someone who had traveled this land before roads were cut, before maps were drawn, when knowing the shape of the earth was the difference between survival and death. After an hour, they stopped in the shadow of a canyon wall. Thomas dismounted and gestured for the others to do the same. "From here we go on foot," he said in Apache, then repeated in Spanish for Miguel's benefit. "The horses stay hidden. If we are seen, we need to move quickly." They tethered the animals in a small box canyon where grass and water indicated this had been a camping spot for generations. Then Thomas led them up a narrow trail that switchbacked along the canyon wall, each step requiring careful placement, the drop below growing more intimidating with every upward turn. Kai moved with confidence born of childhood memories she had thought lost. Her body remembered this kind of terrain even if her conscious mind had tried to forget. Beside her, Miguel struggled, his town-raised muscles unused to this kind of climbing, but he did not complain. Chato moved like water, his slight frame an advantage on paths this narrow. At the top they lay flat on sun-warmed rock and looked down into the canyon below. What Kai saw made her breath catch. A camp sprawled across the canyon floor, perhaps 24 men moving with the purposeful activity of a well-organized operation. Canvas tents clustered around a central area where cooking fires sent smoke into the still morning air. But it was not the camp itself that drew the eye. It was what the men had done to the canyon. They had excavated a shaft that descended into the earth at an angle shored up with timber, like the entrance to a mine. Piles of excavated rock and dirt surrounded the opening, and even from this distance Kai could see the unusual quality of some of the stone. It caught the light differently, seemed to hold a faint luminescence, even in full sun. "Tse Lichi," Thomas whispered. "They have found it." But that was not what made Kai's hands clench into fists. Near the shaft opening, scattered carelessly like broken pottery, lay human bones. Skulls sat atop piles of excavated earth. Long bones protruded from the dirt like accusations. The mining operation had torn through what was clearly a burial site, treating the honored dead like obstacles to be cleared away. "My father," Chato said quietly, his voice barely audible. "He tried to stop them. He said this place was sacred, that our ancestors slept here. They laughed. Then they shot him." Miguel crossed himself, a reflexive Catholic gesture that seemed insufficient for the violation they were witnessing. "Madre de Dios," he breathed. "How can anyone?" "Because to them," Kai said, her voice hard as the stone beneath her, "these are not people. These are inconvenient remnants of a past they would prefer to forget." She studied the operation with the tactical eye that Daniel had trained in her during long evenings when he had insisted she understand how to read terrain, how to assess numbers, how to think like someone planning either attack or defense. The men below were armed rifles leaning against tent posts, gun belts worn even while working. These were not simple laborers. These were men comfortable with violence, expecting it, prepared for it. "We need evidence," Kai said. "Something we can show to authorities, proof that this is a burial ground being desecrated." "Authorities?" Thomas's voice carried bitter amusement. "You think the white man's law will protect Apache graves?" "There are new laws," Kai insisted. "Federal regulations about treatment of native sites. If we can prove this is a sacred burial ground, they cannot legally excavate here." Thomas looked at her with something between pity and respect. "You still believe in their justice?" "I believe," Kai said carefully, "that we use whatever weapons we have. And right now their law is a weapon they cannot ignore as easily as they ignore us." She turned to Miguel. "You have the camera." The boy nodded, pulling from his pack the small box camera that Kai had purchased in town 3 days prior, spending money she could ill afford on equipment she hoped would prove invaluable. It was a simple device, but it would serve. "Good. When we go down, you photograph everything. The bones, the artifacts, the excavation. We need proof that cannot be dismissed or denied." "Go down," Miguel's voice cracked slightly. "Down there, with all those men." "Not now," Kai said. "Tonight, when most of them are asleep and only a few guards remain." They spent the rest of the day observing, learning the rhythms of the camp. Guards changed at regular intervals. Most men ate together at dusk, then retired to their tents. 2 men remained on watch through the night, one near the excavation, one at the camp perimeter. As the sun began its descent, painting the canyon walls in shades of amber and rust, Kai noticed something that made her stiffen. A rider approaching from the north, moving quickly, trailing dust. Even at this distance, she recognized the expensive vest, the particular way the man sat his horse. Victor Blackwood himself, coming to inspect his illegal operation. They watched as Blackwood dismounted, as men gathered around him, as he gestured toward the excavation with movements that suggested excitement barely contained. He descended into the shaft, disappeared for perhaps 20 minutes, then emerged holding something that caught the fading light. A piece of tse lichii, larger than the fragment Thomas had shown Kai, glowing visibly even in daylight. Blackwood held it up like a trophy, and even from their hidden vantage point, Kai could see the triumph on his face. He had found what he sought. The question now was what he would do with it. As darkness fell, they retreated from their observation point to a small cave. Thomas knew a place where Apache scouts had hidden in older times. They ate jerky and hardtack in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. "I will go alone," Kai finally said. 3 voices immediately protested, but she held up her hand. "Think practically. I am the only one who can move silently enough, who has experience in this kind of infiltration. Thomas is too old, though he would never admit it. Miguel, you are brave but untrained, and Chato is injured." "Then I go with you to the canyon edge," Thomas said, his tone allowing no argument. "You may know how to move quietly, but I know this land. I know where the shadows fall, where the stone is loose, where echoes carry. You need my knowledge, even if you do not need my presence at the bottom." Kai considered this, then nodded. "Agreed. Miguel, you and Chato stay here. If we are not back by dawn, ride to the ranch and get help." "Help from who?" Miguel asked reasonably. "Who in this territory will help an Apache woman against Victor Blackwood?" It was a fair question, one for which Kai had no good answer. But Thomas smiled an expression that carried secrets. "There is one," he said. "A white man, a former cavalry scout. Marcus Weller. He lives alone in the hills west of here. He and Blackwood have history, bad history. If the girl does not return, you tell Weller what has happened. He will come." "Why would he help us?" Kai asked. "Because he owes your husband a debt," Thomas said simply. "And because men like Weller, they have honor in strange places. He may hate Apache, may have killed many of us, but he hates men like Blackwood more." It was thin comfort, but comfort nonetheless. As the moon rose, Kai secured her knife, checked the pistol hidden in her pocket, and took her father's Winchester, which she would carry until the final descent. They moved through moonlight that turned the desert silver, every shadow sharp-edged, every sound magnified by the stillness. Thomas led her along paths that seemed to exist only because he remembered them, routes that took advantage of every fold in the land, every depression that offered concealment. At the canyon rim he stopped and pointed out the approach she should take. A narrow chimney in the rock face, invisible from below, that would let her descend without being silhouetted against the sky. "Go carefully," he said in Apache, then added something that made Kai's throat tighten. "Your father would be proud, not because you are brave, but because you choose to be brave for the right reasons." She handed him the Winchester and began her descent. The chimney was tighter than it had looked from above, requiring her to wedge her body between rock faces and inch downward, feeling for holds in darkness. Her dress, caught on stone, tore, became a liability. She should have worn pants, should have planned better, but there was no remedy for it now. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes, her feet touched the canyon floor. She froze, listening. The sound of snoring from the nearest tent, the crackle of a dying fire, the soft footfalls of a guard making his rounds on the far side of the camp. She moved like smoke, like memory, like all the things they had tried to beat out of her in the Indian school. Her body remembered how to place feet without sound, how to breathe without disturbance, how to become part of the landscape rather than an intrusion upon it. The excavation shaft loomed before her timber supports, creating a skeletal entrance to the earth. Around it, the bones lay scattered. She knelt beside a skull, her hand hovering over it without touching, a gesture of respect for whoever this had been. A warrior, perhaps, or a mother, or a child. Someone who had been loved, who had been mourned, who had been laid to rest with ceremony and now was treated like trash. She heard footsteps and flattened herself against the pile of excavated earth. A guard passed within feet of her hiding place, his rifle held loosely, his attention on something in the distance. She waited until he was gone, then moved to the shaft entrance. Inside, the glowing stone provided enough light to see by. The walls were embedded with salichy veins of luminescence running through ordinary rock like frozen lightning. Beautiful and terrible in equal measure, a reminder that some things in the earth were not meant to be disturbed. But beauty was not what she had come for. She needed evidence, needed artifacts that could prove this was a burial site. She searched carefully, her fingers finding pottery shards, a stone tool, and finally, half buried in dirt, a small carved figure. A bear worked from stone by someone with skill and patience placed here to accompany the dead on their journey. She tucked it carefully into her pocket, then froze at the sound of voices approaching the shaft. Two men, their conversation clear in the night quiet. "Blackwood says we should be hitting the main deposit any day now," one said. "Says this could be the biggest strike since the California gold rush." "What about the bodies? Don't seem right digging up graves." "They are just Indians, not like they are real people." Kai felt rage rise in her throat like bile, but she forced it down. Rage was useless. Rage made you careless. She needed to be anything but careless right now. The men stopped at the shaft entrance close enough that she could smell tobacco smoke and unwashed bodies. If they brought a lantern, she would be discovered. For a long moment the universe held its breath. Then one of the men yawned. "Too tired for this. Let the morning shift worry about it." They moved away, their footsteps receding into the night. Kai exhaled slowly, silently, then moved to the shaft entrance. She needed photographs, needed Miguel's camera, but Miguel was at the cave. She would have to come back tomorrow night, would have to risk this descent again. But as she prepared to leave, she saw something that changed everything. Near the excavation entrance, partially concealed by canvas, sat wooden crates, dynamite enough to level half the canyon. And beside them, a map weighted down with stones showing not just this site but others. 3 more locations marked with X, all on or near land that belonged to Apache families. Families that had been pushed onto reservations, families whose absence made their sacred sites vulnerable. Blackwood was not just excavating one site, he was planning a systematic rape of every Apache burial ground in the region. Kai's hand shook as she memorized the map, committing to memory the locations, the notations. This was bigger than her ranch, bigger than one widow's fight to keep what was hers. This was cultural genocide, the final erasure of her people from the land their ancestors had walked for generations beyond counting. She heard movement and looked up to see Thomas at the canyon rim signaling urgency. Time to leave. The climb back up the chimney seemed to take forever, her muscles burning. Her dress shredded, her hands bleeding from sharp rock. But she made it, collapsing onto the rim beside Thomas, her breath coming in gasps. "Guards," he whispered. "They are changing shifts early. We must go now." They ran through moonlight, abandoning stealth for speed, trusting to luck and the incompetence of men who thought themselves safe. Behind them, shouts rose as someone noticed disturbance around the excavation. A rifle shot cracked through the night, the bullet striking stone somewhere to their left. They did not stop until they reached the horses, until they were mounted and riding hard through darkness, putting distance between themselves and pursuit. At the cave, Miguel and Chato waited with fear written on their young faces. But when Kai showed them what she had taken, when she described what she had seen, fear transformed into something else. Determination. Purpose. The knowledge that some fights were worth the risk. "We go to the ranch," Kai said, her voice steady despite exhaustion. "We develop the photographs we will take tomorrow. We document everything. And then we take it to the authorities, to the newspapers, to anyone who will listen." "And if no one listens?" Miguel asked. Kai looked at the carved bear in her palm, worn smooth by hands long dead, placed with love beside someone's final rest. "Then we make them listen. Whatever it takes." They rode through what remained of the night, four souls bound together by necessity and shared outrage, carrying evidence of crimes that most would prefer to ignore. But Kai had learned something in that canyon, in that shaft lit by the glow of stolen stones. She had learned that her fight was not just about land or law, or the careful navigation of a society that despised her. It was about memory, about refusing to let her people be erased as if they had never existed, about standing between the past and those who would destroy it for profit. Dawn found them back at the ranch, exhausted but unbroken. As Kai unsaddled her horse, she noticed Miguel staring at something in the distance, a rider approaching, moving with deliberate slowness. She reached for her rifle, but Thomas put a hand on her arm. "Wait," he said. "I know this rider." The man who dismounted in her yard was perhaps 50 years old, weathered and hard as desert stone, his eyes the pale blue of winter sky. He wore no uniform, but something in his bearing spoke of military service long past. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "My name is Marcus Weller. I heard you might need help." Kai studied him. This man who had killed her people, who owed her dead husband some unnamed debt, who had chosen to ride through the night to offer assistance to a woman most would prefer to see gone. "Why?" she asked simply. Weller looked away toward the rising sun. "Because some debts cannot be paid, only honored. Because your husband saved my life when he had every reason to let me die. Because I have done enough wrong in my life to know it when I see it in others." He turned back to her, and in his eyes she saw something she had not expected. Shame, regret, the weight of choices that could not be unmade. "Blackwood needs to be stopped," Weller said. "I should have stopped him 15 years ago. I did not. That is on me. But maybe it is not too late to do right this time." Kai considered this offer, knowing it came with complications, with history, with the blood of her people on hands now extended in alliance. But she also knew that righteousness without power was merely performance, and she needed all the power she could gather. "Then welcome Marcus Weller," she said. "We have work to do." The ranch house became a war room in the days that followed, though the war being planned would be fought with evidence and testimony rather than bullets. Maps covered the kitchen table, weighted down with coffee cups and stones. Photographs hung from twine strung across the ceiling, still damp from the developing solution Miguel had learned to mix under Kai's patient instruction. The images were damning. Bones scattered like discarded refuse, mining equipment positioned over what was clearly a burial site, men casually smoking while standing on excavated graves. Each photograph told a story that needed no translation, that transcended language, and spoke directly to anyone with a shred of human decency. Marcus Weller sat across from Kai, studying the map he had helped her create. 3 additional sites marked in Blackwood's hidden plans, each one corresponding to Apache burial grounds on land, recently acquired through methods that ranged from questionable to overtly fraudulent. "He has been planning this for years," Weller said, his finger tracing the pattern. "Buying up land through shell companies, waiting for the right moment. The Starstone deposits run in a line through this whole region. He means to control all of it." "Can we prove the land acquisitions were illegal?" Kai asked. "Proving and getting anyone to care are different things." Weller leaned back, his chair creaking. "The territorial government is corrupt as hell. Half the officials are in someone's pocket. Blackwood has been spreading money around for a long time." Thomas, who had been silent until now, spoke in Apache. Kai translated for Weller's benefit. "He says there is federal law now. The Indian Appropriations Act has provisions about protecting native sites. If we can get word to Washington, to someone who cares about such things—" "That takes time we do not have," Weller interrupted. "Blackwood knows someone was in his camp. He knows he has been compromised. He will move quickly now, probably try to extract as much as he can before anyone official shows up asking questions." Sarah Wilson appeared in the doorway, surprising them all. She had taken to visiting the ranch daily, ostensibly to check on borrowed tools or discuss water rights, but Kai suspected the girl was simply desperate for purpose beyond the narrow confines her father's ranch offered. "There is a territorial judge arriving in 3 weeks," Sarah announced without preamble. "Circuit Court in Santa Fe. Judge Morrison from back east, supposed to be honest. If you could present evidence to him." 3 weeks is too long, Kai said. In 3 weeks, Blackwood could have stripped those sites clean and scattered the evidence. "Then we make him stop now," Miguel said from where he sat cleaning rifles by the window. The boy had changed in the past weeks, hardened by necessity, his idealism tempered but not broken. "We go to his camp and we stop him." "With what?" Weller asked, not unkindly. 5 of us against 20 armed men, that is called suicide, boy." "Then we find more people," Miguel insisted. "There must be others who oppose him, who see what he is doing is wrong." Kai looked at the faces around her table. An old Apache warrior living on borrowed time. A former cavalry scout carrying more guilt than any man should bear. A Mexican boy running from a past he could not change. A white girl rebelling against a father who could not see beyond his prejudices. And herself a widow, caught between worlds, fighting for something most considered already lost. They were not an army, but perhaps they did not need to be. "Thomas," she said slowly, "how many Apache families remain in the region? Not on reservations, but here hiding, living quietly?" The old man considered. "Perhaps 50 people scattered across the territory, families that refused to go, that found ways to stay, to survive unseen. And if they knew their burial grounds were being desecrated, if they knew there was a chance to fight back legally to protect what remains—" Thomas smiled, understanding dawning. "They would come. Not all, but enough. Enough to stand witness, to testify that these are sacred sites." "That still does not solve the immediate problem," Weller pointed out. "Blackwood will not stop excavating just because people show up to protest. He has armed guards and the territorial government in his pocket." A knock at the door interrupted them. Kai moved instinctively for her rifle, but Sarah was already opening the door to reveal a figure she recognized. Sheriff Doug Harmon stood on the porch, his hat in his hands, his posture suggesting discomfort, approaching pain. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, not meeting her eyes. "Might I have a word?" Kai gestured him inside. The sheriff entered like a man walking to his own hanging, his eyes taking in the maps, the photographs, the gathered conspirators. When his gaze landed on Weller, something complicated passed over his face. "Marcus," he acknowledged. "Doug," Weller replied neutrally. Harmon turned to Kai. "I am here unofficially. What I am about to tell you, I am telling you because I have a son in the Army, and I would like to be able to look him in the eye when he comes home." "Go on," Kai said. The sheriff pulled a folded document from his coat. "Victor Blackwood filed papers with the territorial court yesterday. He is claiming your ranch is being used to harbor fugitive Indians in violation of federal relocation orders. He has named you specifically as an unlawful occupant of land that should revert to the territory." Kai felt ice in her stomach. "On what grounds?" "On the grounds that you as an Apache woman have no legal right to inherit property from your deceased husband. He is arguing that your marriage was invalid because you were technically ward of the government at the time, living on federal land without authorization." "That is insane," Sarah burst out. "She was legally married. There are records." "Records can be challenged," Harmon said wearily, "especially when the person challenging them has enough money to make judges see things his way. He has given you 48 hours to vacate the property before he brings federal marshals to remove you forcibly." Weller stood abruptly. "A land grab, pure and simple, using the law as a weapon." "I know what it is," Harmon said. "Why do you think I am here warning you instead of serving the papers officially?" He looked at Kai, and she saw genuine regret in his eyes. "I have done a lot of things I am not proud of. I have looked the other way when I should have stood firm. I have taken money from men I knew were criminals. But this—" he gestured at the photographs hanging from the ceiling. "This is too much, even for me." "What are you saying?" Kai asked carefully. "I am saying I cannot stop him officially, but I can buy you time. I can delay serving those papers for a day, maybe 2. And I can tell you that Blackwood is planning something for tomorrow night. I do not know what exactly, but I heard him talking about making sure no evidence remains by the end of the week." "He is going to destroy the sites," Thomas said quietly. "Use that dynamite we saw. Bring down the canyon walls and bury everything." Kai's mind raced through possibilities, calculating odds, weighing risks. Every option seemed impossible, but impossibility had never stopped her people before. It would not stop her now. "Then we force his hand," she said. "Tonight. We go back to that camp, but this time we do not sneak. We go openly with witnesses, with cameras, with anyone we can gather. We make it public. Make it something he cannot hide or explain away." "Madness," Weller said. "His men are armed. They will not just let you walk in and document their crimes." "They will if we come with federal authority," Kai said. She turned to Harmon. "You are still sheriff. You have the legal right to investigate reports of illegal activity on public land." Harmon paled. "If I do this, Blackwood will destroy me. I will lose my job, maybe worse." "You will lose your soul if you do not," Kai said bluntly. "Is that worth a job?" The sheriff was quiet for a long moment, some internal battle playing out across his weathered features. Finally he nodded. "My son needs a father he can respect more than I need a paycheck." "What do you need me to do?" What followed was a flurry of activity that would have seemed impossible had desperation not made it necessary. Thomas rode out to contact Apache families scattered across the territory carrying word that sacred ground needed defending. Sarah returned to her father's ranch not to ask permission, but to inform him that his daughter would be standing witness to injustice whether he approved or not. Miguel and Chato prepared horses and supplies for a journey that might turn violent despite best intentions. And Kai wrote. She wrote letters to newspapers in Santa Fe and Tucson and as far away as San Francisco. She wrote to the Bureau of Indian Affairs, to the territorial governor, to anyone whose address she could find or invent. Each letter was the same. A formal complaint about illegal excavation of protected burial grounds, about fraud in land acquisition, about violence against native people trying to defend what was theirs. She knew most of the letters would be ignored, but all it took was one person who cared, one editor who saw a story, one official who still believed in justice. All it took was one spark. As evening fell, people began arriving. First came Elena Morales with her 2 sons, both carrying rifles and grim expressions. Then came 3 Apache families. Thomas had contacted their faces, showing the same mix of fear and determination Kai felt in her own chest. Jack Wilson arrived, his presence shocking everyone, including his daughter. "Before you say anything," he told Kai gruffly, "I am not doing this for you. I am doing it because Blackwood tried to buy my land last month, and when I refused, someone cut my fence lines and poisoned my water hole. I do not care about Indian graves or sacred sites, but I care about men who think they can take whatever they want." It was not friendship, not alliance based on shared ideals, but Kai would take what she could get. In war, even uncomfortable allies were better than noble isolation. By the time night fell completely, she had gathered perhaps 20 people, not an army, but more than she had dared hope for. They stood in her yard, an unlikely coalition bound by little except shared opposition to Victor Blackwood's greed. "Thank you for coming," Kai said, addressing them in English and having Thomas translate to Apache. "What we do tonight is dangerous. Blackwood's men are armed and have shown they are willing to kill. But what we do is also necessary. If we do not stand now, if we do not say enough, then we are complicit in the destruction of something that can never be replaced." She paused, looking at faces lit by lantern light, young and old, Apache and Mexican and white, united by the fragile belief that right might still matter. "We ride in 1 hour," she continued. "We ride to the canyon and we bear witness. We photograph, we document, we make sure that what Blackwood is doing cannot be hidden or denied. And if he tries to stop us, Sheriff Harmon will arrest him for obstruction of justice." Harmon looked slightly sick at this pronouncement, but did not contradict her. As people dispersed to prepare, Weller pulled Kai aside. "You know this could go very wrong. Blackwood is not a man who backs down easily." "I know," Kai said, "but neither am I." They rode through moonlight that turned the desert ghostly, a procession of horses and riders that must have looked from a distance like something from older times, like the raiding parties that once moved through this land before wire and rail and the relentless press of settlement made such things impossible. Kai rode at the front beside Thomas, acutely aware of how exposed they were, how vulnerable. But exposure was the point. This was not a raid. This was a declaration. The canyon appeared as a darker shadow against the night sky. As they drew closer, Kai could see the camp below, lanterns burning, men moving about in the casual confidence of those who believed themselves safe from scrutiny. That confidence was about to be shattered. They descended into the canyon in full view, making no attempt at stealth. By the time they reached the valley floor, Blackwood's men had noticed them, shouts of alarm spreading through the camp like fire through dry grass. Victor Blackwood himself emerged from the largest tent, his face transforming from sleep confusion to rage as he recognized Kai at the head of the column. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, striding forward. "This is private property. You are all trespassing." "Actually," Sheriff Harmon said, nudging his horse forward, "this is federal land, and I am here investigating reports of illegal excavation and desecration of protected sites." Blackwood's eyes narrowed. "Sheriff Harmon, I am surprised to see you. Surprised and disappointed. I thought we had an understanding." "We did," Harmon said quietly. "I was wrong to make it." For a moment, violence trembled in the air like heat shimmer. Blackwood's men had gathered, rifles in hand, outnumbering Kai's group 2-1. One word from Blackwood, one gesture, and this could become a massacre. But Blackwood was too smart for that, too aware that among Kai's group were white settlers whose deaths would bring investigation he could not bribe away. So instead he smiled, cold and calculating. "By all means investigate," he said. "You will find our permits in order. We have every legal right to be here." "Then you will have no objection to us documenting the site," Kai said, signaling Miguel forward with the camera. "Document all you wish," Blackwood replied. "Though I wonder what a collection of Indians and Mexican rabble think they will accomplish with a few photographs." Miguel began his work capturing images of the excavation, the scattered bones, the mining equipment positioned over what was clearly a burial ground. As he worked, the Apache families began a low chant, a mourning song for the disturbed dead. The sound seemed to affect Blackwood's men in ways that rifles and threats had not. Several shifted uncomfortably. One removed his hat. The chant grew louder, filling the canyon with grief made audible. Kai dismounted and walked to the excavation shaft. Blackwood moved to block her, but Weller was suddenly there, his hand resting meaningfully on his sidearm. "Let her pass," Weller said quietly. "Since when does Marcus Weller defend Indians?" Blackwood asked, genuine confusion mixing with his anger. "Since he remembered what honor means," Weller replied. Kai entered the shaft, lantern held high. The walls glowed with veins of starstone, beautiful and terrible. But it was not the mineral wealth that made her catch her breath. It was the artifacts still visible in the walls. Pottery pressed into earth. Stone tools placed with care. The outline of bodies, their positions suggesting they had been laid to rest with ceremony and love. This was not just a burial ground. This was a sacred place, a connection to ancestors, a physical manifestation of memory and continuity that stretched back generations beyond counting. She emerged from the shaft to find the situation had changed. More people had arrived. Apache families Thomas had contacted, drawn by word spreading through networks invisible to white eyes. They lined the canyon rim above silent witnesses, their presence transforming this from a confrontation into something larger. Blackwood saw them too. His face paled as he realized he was surrounded not by armed opponents, but by something more dangerous. Witnesses, people who would remember, who would speak, who would make his crimes impossible to bury. "This changes nothing," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I have lawyers. I have connections. You are a collection of Indians and peasants who think sentiment outweighs property rights." "You are wrong," Kai said quietly. We are people defending what is ours, what has always been ours, and you are a thief trying to justify theft with paperwork." She turned to address not just Blackwood but his men, the Apache witnesses above her own unlikely coalition. "This land holds the bones of my ancestors. The people who walked here before borders were drawn, before deeds were written, before anyone thought to measure the earth in acres and dollars. They sleep here because this place was sacred to them, because they believed their spirits would walk here forever. And now men who care only for profit want to dig them up and scatter them like garbage." Her voice rose, carrying through the canyon. "But we say no. We say these graves will be protected. We say that some things matter more than money. We say that our dead deserve rest, that our sacred places deserve protection, that our right to exist as a people will not be erased for the convenience of those who want to pretend we were never here." Silence fell when she finished. Even Blackwood seemed momentarily at a loss for words. Then, from the canyon rim, one of the Apache elders began to sing. Others joined their voices, weaving together in a song so old no one remembered who first sang it. It spoke of the earth and those who return to it, of the continuity between the living and the dead, of obligations that transcend law and property, and the temporary concerns of those who think they own what cannot truly be owned. As Kai listened, she felt something shift inside her. For 20 years she had tried to be something other than Apache, had learned to speak and dress and think like those who despised her heritage. But standing in this canyon, surrounded by the bones of her ancestors and the voices of her people, she understood that denying who she was had never protected her. It had only made her easier to dismiss. She was Apache, daughter of Naiche, keeper of stories that predated the nation trying to erase them, and she would not be erased. "Sheriff Harmon," she said formally, "I am filing an official complaint. Victor Blackwood and the Arizona Mining Company are illegally excavating a protected burial site in violation of federal law. I request that you shut down this operation immediately and hold those responsible pending investigation." Harmon looked at Blackwood, then at the gathered witnesses, then at the photographs Miguel had taken. For a man whose career had been built on compromise and looking the other way, this was the moment that would define everything that came after. "Mr. Blackwood," he said, his voice carrying the weight of a decision that could not be unmade, "you and your men are to cease all excavation immediately. This site is now under investigation. Anyone who interferes will be arrested for obstruction of justice." Blackwood's face went through several colors before settling on a dangerous red. "You are making a mistake, Harmon, a career-ending mistake." "Maybe," the sheriff agreed, "but at least I will be able to sleep at night." As dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, Kai stood with her people amid the wreckage of Blackwood's ambitions, knowing this was not victory, but merely the first battle in a war that would continue long after this night was over. But for now, for this moment, the dead could rest undisturbed, and that was enough. The confrontation in the canyon ended not with violence, but with something more powerful and more dangerous to men like Victor Blackwood. It ended with documentation, with witnesses whose testimony could not be easily dismissed, with photographs that told stories no amount of money could rewrite. But as Kai rode back to her ranch in the gray light of dawn, exhaustion settling into her bones, she knew the battle was far from over. Blackwood had retreated, but retreat was not surrender. Men with his resources and connections did not accept defeat gracefully. The proof came 3 days later. Kai was in the barn with Miguel, teaching him how to properly shoe a horse, when she heard the sound of approaching riders. Not the casual approach of neighbors or the hurried urgency of messengers, but something else. The deliberate, unhurried pace of those who knew they held power and wanted everyone to know it. She straightened, wiping sweat from her face, and moved to the barn entrance. What she saw made her blood run cold despite the desert heat. A dozen riders, all wearing the brass stars of federal marshals. At their head rode a man she recognized from her brief time in Santa Fe, Deputy Marshal James Cord. Behind them came a wagon carrying what appeared to be official documents and surveying equipment, and at the rear, sitting his horse with the smug satisfaction of a cat that has cornered a mouse, rode Victor Blackwood. Cord dismounted with the careful movements of a man who had spent too many hours in the saddle. He was perhaps 40, with the weathered face of someone who had seen the worst humanity offered and learned to function despite it. His eyes, when they met Kai's, held something she had not expected: regret. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, removing his hat, "I am Deputy Marshal James Cord. I am here on official business regarding the property known as Calloway Ranch." "What business?" Kai asked, though dread was already forming in her stomach. Cord pulled a document from his saddlebag. "I have here a court order from the territorial legislature. It states that this property, acquired through marriage to a deceased cavalry officer, has been found to be in violation of the Indian Appropriations Act of 1871. As an Apache woman, you are considered a ward of the federal government and therefore ineligible to hold private property outside designated reservation lands." The words fell like stones, each one carefully placed to build a wall between Kai and everything she had fought to protect. "That law does not apply to me," Kai said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "I was legally married. My husband purchased this land with his own money. It passed to me through legitimate inheritance." "The court has ruled otherwise," Cord said, and she could hear genuine regret in his voice. "Mr. Blackwood has petitioned to purchase the land at fair market value. The court has determined that as you cannot legally own it, the property reverts to territorial control and may be sold." "This is theft," Kai said flatly, dressed up in legal language, but theft nonetheless. Blackwood urged his horse forward, unable to contain his triumph. "This is justice, Mrs. Calloway. Or should I call you by your Indian name? The law is quite clear. Savages cannot own civilized property. Your marriage was a legal fiction, and this land was never truly yours." Kai's hand moved instinctively toward her knife, but Weller's voice stopped her. He had appeared from the ranch house, rifle held loosely but ready. "Those are fighting words, Blackwood," he said quietly. "You might want to reconsider them." "Is that a threat, Marcus?" Blackwood asked. "In front of federal marshals, how very foolish of you." Cord raised a hand. "Gentlemen, please, this does not need to become violent." He turned back to Kai. "Mrs. Calloway, the order gives you 72 hours to vacate the property. After that, we are authorized to remove you by force if necessary. I am sorry, truly, but this is the law." "Your law," Thomas said, emerging from the shadows of the barn where he had been listening. He spoke in Apache, his words carrying the weight of centuries, and Kai translated. "He says your law is built on theft and murder. He says you take land that was never yours to take, then write papers that say the theft was legal. He says calling robbery justice does not make it so." Cord looked uncomfortable. "I do not make the laws, old man. I only enforce them." "Then you are complicit," Kai said. "Every man who hides behind duty to avoid moral choice is complicit in the crimes his duty demands." Silence fell, broken only by the restless shifting of horses and the whisper of wind through the canyon beyond. Cord looked at Kai with something approaching pain in his eyes. "I will give you the full 72 hours, he finally said. "Use them wisely. Perhaps you can find a lawyer, file an appeal. I have seen stranger things succeed in territorial courts." "We both know no appeal will succeed," Kai replied. "Not when the judge has already been bought." Cord did not deny it. He simply replaced his hat, mounted his horse, and prepared to leave. But before he turned away, he spoke one final time. "For what it is worth, Mrs. Calloway, your husband once saved my life during a skirmish near Fort Grant. He spoke often of you, of your strength and intelligence. He would be proud of how you have fought. I am sorry the law does not protect those it should." As the marshals rode away, leaving only dust and the echo of hoofbeats, Kai stood in her yard, feeling the full weight of impossible odds. 72 hours to somehow overturn a territorial court decision backed by corruption and racist law. 72 hours before she lost everything Daniel had left her, everything her ancestors had died defending. Miguel approached cautiously. "What do we do?" Kai looked at the ranch house, at the land stretching away toward mountains that had watched generations of her people live and die. She thought of her father's rifle, of Thomas's stories, of the dream catcher hanging above her door, that had been woven by a mother who believed her daughter would someday come home. "We fight," she said simply, "but not with guns, not yet." The next hours passed in a blur of desperate activity. Kai sent Miguel riding to Santa Fe with letters for every newspaper, every lawyer, every official whose name she could remember. She sent Thomas to gather the Apache families again to bring witnesses who could testify about the land's history, about burial grounds and sacred sites that predated any white claim. Sarah Wilson appeared with news from town. Her father, despite his prejudices, had been quietly gathering signatures from other ranchers, a petition stating that if Kai's land could be taken through legal manipulation, none of them were safe. It was self-interest rather than altruism, but Kai would take what she could get. Elena Morales brought food and something more valuable: information. "I spoke with the clerk at the territorial courthouse," she said, unpacking bread and dried meat. "The one who drinks too much and talks when he should not. He said Judge Morrison, the one everyone says is honest, is due in Santa Fe next week. If you could get your case before him instead of the local judges Blackwood controls." "How?" Kai asked. "The order has already been issued. How do I get a new hearing?" "By making it impossible for them to ignore you," Elena said. "By making this so public, so visible, that they cannot quietly steal your land without the whole territory watching." Kai looked at the older woman with new appreciation. "What do you have in mind?" What Elena proposed was audacious, bordering on insane, but desperate times called for desperate measures. That evening, as the sun painted the desert in shades of fire, Kai stood on her porch and addressed the 40 people who had gathered. Apache families, Mexican laborers, a few white ranchers whose own security depended on property law meaning something. Even Jack Wilson stood among them, his face sour, but his presence significant. "You all know what has happened," Kai said. "The territorial court has ruled that I cannot own this land because of my Apache blood. In 3 days, marshals will come to remove me by force. When they do, I will not resist with violence. But I will not go quietly either." She paused, letting her words settle. "I am going to Santa Fe. I am going to stand before the territorial courthouse and demand that Judge Morrison hear my case. I am going to bring evidence of corruption, of illegal excavation, of laws twisted to serve greed rather than justice. And I am going to stay there in front of that courthouse until someone with power chooses to do what is right." "They will arrest you," Weller said bluntly. "Call it disturbing the peace or some such nonsense." "Let them," Kai replied. "Let them arrest an Apache widow for demanding justice. Let them do it in front of newspapers and witnesses. Let them show the territory exactly what their law protects and what it destroys." Thomas stepped forward and spoke in Apache, his words carrying the gravity of ritual. Kai translated. "He says in the old days, when our people faced impossible odds, they would sing their death songs. Not because they wanted to die, but because they wanted their enemies to know they did not fear death. To know that some things mattered more than survival. He says perhaps it is time to sing again, but not songs of death. Songs of defiance. Songs that remind the world we are still here." The Apache families began to sing a sound that rose from deep in their chests, that spoke of sorrow and strength woven together. It was not a war song. It was something older, something that acknowledged pain without surrendering to it. As Kai listened, she made her final decision. She would go to Santa Fe. She would stand before power with nothing but truth and witnesses and the stubborn refusal to disappear. And if they arrested her, if they dragged her away, at least she would force them to see what they were doing, to acknowledge the human cost of laws designed to erase humanity. The journey to Santa Fe took 2 days of hard riding. Kai, Thomas, Miguel, Elena, Sarah, and a dozen Apache families made the trip together, a procession that drew stares in every small settlement they passed. By the time they reached the territorial capital, word had spread. The Apache widow was coming to challenge the government. Santa Fe in 1885 was a city caught between worlds. Ancient adobe buildings stood alongside new Victorian structures. Mexican and Indian and white populations mixed in uneasy proximity. The courthouse sat in the plaza, a two-story building that represented law and order to some, oppression to others. Kai arrived at dawn and positioned herself on the courthouse steps. She carried a sign Miguel had painted, simple words that needed no embellishment. Apache widow demands justice. Will the law protect greed or honor? The Apache families arranged themselves around her, singing their songs, holding photographs of desecrated burial grounds. Elena and Sarah distributed printed statements detailing Blackwood's crimes, his illegal excavations, his corruption of local officials. And they waited. At first, officials tried to ignore them. Clerks hurried past without making eye contact. Lawyers crossed the street to avoid confrontation. But as the morning wore on, as the singing continued and the crowd grew, ignoring became impossible. Newspaper reporters arrived, drawn by the spectacle. Kai spoke to each one, careful and precise, outlining her case in language they could print. The illegal land seizure. The desecration of burial grounds. The court order based on racist law rather than legal precedent. By midday, a crowd had gathered. Some sympathetic, some hostile, all curious. Kai stood at the center, exhausted but unbending, her voice growing hoarse from repeating her story. Then Victor Blackwood arrived with lawyers and hired men, his face twisted with rage. "This is harassment," he shouted, pushing through the crowd. "Sheriff, arrest this woman for disturbing the peace." The local sheriff, a different man than Harmon but cut from similar cloth, looked uncertain. Arresting a woman in front of this many witnesses, especially reporters from papers as far away as San Francisco, could make him look like the villain. "She is not disturbing anything," someone called from the crowd. "She is just standing there." "She is inciting unrest," Blackwood insisted. "She is gathering Indians and making accusations without proof." "We have proof," Kai said, her voice carrying clearly. She held up the photographs Miguel had taken. "We have documentation of your illegal excavations. We have testimony from witnesses. We have evidence that you bribed officials to obtain a fraudulent court order. And we have the law itself, which you have twisted to serve your greed." Blackwood lunged toward her, but Weller was suddenly there, his hand catching Blackwood's wrist in a grip that made the mining magnate wince. "Touch her, and you will answer to me," Weller said quietly. For a moment, violence trembled between them. Then a new voice cut through the tension. "What is the meaning of this disturbance?" The crowd parted to reveal a man in his 60s, well-dressed, carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Judge Morrison had arrived 2 weeks ahead of schedule, drawn by telegrams from the territorial governor about disturbances in the capital and reports of an Apache widow challenging the courts in public. Blackwood immediately composed himself. "Your Honor, thank goodness you are here. This woman is making wild accusations, disturbing the peace, refusing to accept a lawful court order." Morrison looked at Kai, at the photographs in her hand, at the Apache families singing their grief. "And what accusations are those?" Kai met his eyes without flinching. That Victor Blackwood orchestrated a fraudulent land seizure using racist law to cover his crimes. That he illegally excavated protected burial grounds. That he corrupted local officials to obtain a court order stripping me of property legally inherited from my deceased husband. That your territorial government cares more about mining profits than human decency. Morrison's eyebrows rose. "Those are serious charges." "They are true charges," Kai replied. "And I have evidence. Photographs, testimony documents. All I ask is that you look at them. All I ask is that the law means something beyond whatever the powerful say it means." The judge was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving between Kai and Blackwood, between the singing Apache families and the uncomfortable crowd of onlookers. Finally he spoke. "I will hear this case tomorrow morning. Both parties will present evidence before me in a formal hearing. Until then, no one is to be arrested. No one is to be removed from any property, and everyone is to conduct themselves with decorum befitting civilized people." He turned to leave, then paused. "Mrs. Calloway, I knew your husband briefly. He was an honorable man. I will give you a fair hearing. Whether that results in justice remains to be seen." As Morrison disappeared into the courthouse, Kai felt her knees weaken. Thomas caught her elbow, steadying her. "You did well," he said in Apache. Your father would be proud." That night, camped in the plaza because no hotel would rent them rooms, Kai lay awake watching stars wheel overhead. Around her, the Apache families slept, their presence a reminder that she did not fight alone, that individual battles were part of larger struggles, that her fight was. Their fight was the fight of everyone who refused to disappear quietly. Tomorrow would bring the hearing. Tomorrow she would stand before power and plead her case. Tomorrow she might lose everything or gain a chance at something approaching justice. But tonight, surrounded by her people, she allowed herself a moment of something that felt almost like hope. In the darkness, Sarah Wilson approached. The girl had barely spoken since they arrived, overwhelmed perhaps by the magnitude of what she had committed to. "Are you afraid?" Sarah asked quietly. "Terrified," Kai admitted. "But fear has never stopped me before. It walks beside me like a shadow. The question is not whether you feel it, but whether you let it choose for you. What if you lose tomorrow? What if the judge rules against you?" Kai was quiet for a moment, considering. "Then I will have lost, having fought with everything I had. And there is honor in that, more honor than in surrendering without resistance." She looked at the girl, saw in her face the same hunger for meaning beyond the narrow confines society offered. "Why did you come, Sarah? Why risk your father's anger, your reputation, everything for an Apache widow you barely know?" Sarah smiled, sad and knowing. "Because if I did not, I would spend the rest of my life wondering what I could have been if I had been brave enough to try. Because watching you fight reminded me that cages are only permanent if we accept them as such." As dawn approached, Kai rose and walked to the edge of the plaza, looking out at Santa Fe awakening. Somewhere in this city, Victor Blackwood was preparing his case, gathering his lawyers, planning his strategy. Somewhere, Judge Morrison was perhaps reading the documents she had submitted, weighing law against justice, precedent against decency. And somewhere, Daniel's spirit was watching. She could feel him not as a ghost, but as a presence woven into the fabric of everything he had done to prepare her for this moment. The land he had chosen, the rifle he had kept, the letters he had written, all of it building toward now, toward this final confrontation between the past he had tried to protect and the future he had believed she could secure. "I hope I do not disappoint you," she whispered to the morning air. "I hope I am worth what you believed I could be." The sun crested the eastern mountains, flooding the plaza with golden light. In that light, Kai stood straight, shoulders back, ready to face whatever the day would bring. She was Apache. She was widow. She was warrior without weapon, fighting battles without blood. And she would not yield. The territorial courthouse filled before dawn, every bench packed with bodies, every wall lined with those who had come to witness history or spectacle, depending on their perspective. Word had spread through Santa Fe like wildfire. The Apache widow versus the mining magnate. Law versus justice. The old world colliding with the new in a courtroom that smelled of tobacco and nervous sweat. Kai sat at a table with a young lawyer from the Indian Rights Association, a man barely out of law school named William Hartwell, who had arrived the previous evening with more idealism than experience. Across the aisle, Victor Blackwood commanded a team of 3 attorneys whose combined fees probably exceeded what most families earned in a lifetime. Judge Morrison entered precisely at 9, his robes crisp, his expression unreadable. The room rose as one, then settled into expectant silence. "This is a hearing to determine the validity of a territorial court order regarding property known as Callaway Ranch." Morrison began, his voice carrying clearly through the packed room. "Mrs. Kai Callaway contests the order on grounds that it was obtained through fraud and misapplication of law. Mr. Blackwood maintains the order is legally sound. We will hear evidence from both parties." Blackwood's lead attorney stood a silver-haired man named Thornton, whose suits cost more than horses. "Your Honor, this case is quite simple. Mrs. Callaway, as an Apache woman, falls under the Indian Appropriations Act as a ward of the federal government. Federal wards cannot hold private property. Her marriage to Daniel Callaway, while perhaps valid in sentiment, did not grant her legal capacity to inherit property upon his death. Therefore, the land reverts to territorial control. "And the evidence supporting this interpretation?" Morrison asked. Thornton presented documents, precedents from other cases, citations from federal law. It was impressive in its thoroughness, a wall of legal language designed to obscure the simple theft at its heart. When he finished, Morrison turned to Kai's table. "Mr. Hartwell, your response." The young lawyer stood, his hands shaking slightly as he gathered his papers. "Your Honor, the Indian Appropriations Act contains specific exemptions for natives who have legally married citizens and who reside outside reservation lands. Mrs. Calloway meets both criteria. Furthermore, her husband purchased the property with legally earned income before his marriage, then formally transferred ownership to include her name upon their wedding. This is documented and registered with the Territorial Land Office." "Documented with potentially fraudulent papers," Thornton interrupted. "We have reason to believe the transfer was backdated, that Mrs. Calloway was never a legal owner." "That is a lie," Kai said, her voice cutting through the courtroom chatter. She stood without waiting for permission, ignoring Hartwell's panicked gesture to sit. "Daniel and I were married legally in 1878. The property transfer occurred 6 months later. All documents were filed properly and witnessed. If Mr. Thornton wishes to claim fraud, let him produce evidence rather than convenient suppositions." Morrison's gavel cracked. "Mrs. Calloway, you will speak when recognized by this court." "Then recognize me," Kai said, not sitting. "Because I am the only one in this room whose entire life hangs on these proceedings. Everyone else goes home afterward to comfortable houses and full bellies. I go to nothing if you rule against me." The judge studied her for a long moment. "Very well. You may testify, but you will do so from the witness chair under oath and with proper respect for this court's procedures." Kai moved to the witness stand, her hand on the Bible as she swore to tell the truth. As if truth had ever mattered to men who wrote laws to justify their thefts. Thornton approached with the predatory confidence of a lawyer who has never lost a case he cared about winning. "Mrs. Calloway, or should I use your Apache name?" "My name is Kai Neshoba Calloway," she said evenly. "All of it. I do not choose between my heritage and my marriage. I am both." "How convenient," Thornton said with a thin smile. "Tell me, when did you first meet your husband?" "When I was 10 years old. His cavalry unit attacked our rancheria. He pulled me from a burning wickiup instead of leaving me to die." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Thornton had clearly not expected such blunt honesty. "So you married the man who participated in the destruction of your family. That seems rather opportunistic." "I married the man who saved my life when he could have looked away," Kai replied. "The man who, despite his uniform and orders, chose mercy over expedience. The man who spent the rest of his life trying to atone for what his government did to my people. Is that opportunism or survival? You tell me which you would choose if your family lay dead and the choice was between hatred and hope." Thornton regrouped quickly. "Regardless of sentimentality, the law is clear. Indians cannot own land outside reservations." "Then the law is unjust," Kai said simply, "and unjust laws deserve to be challenged. That is not your decision to make. You are a ward of the federal government. I am a citizen by marriage. I pay taxes. I follow laws, even ones designed to oppress me. What more does citizenship require?" Thornton changed tactics. "Let us discuss the real issue, the land in question. You are aware it contains valuable mineral deposits." "I am aware Mr. Blackwood believes it does." "And you wish to keep those deposits for yourself to profit from resources that should benefit the territory." Kai's laugh was bitter. "Profit. I struggle to keep enough food to feed myself and one boy who works for me. I have no interest in mining. I want only to protect sacred ground from men who see graves as obstacles to wealth." "Sacred ground?" Thornton's voice dripped skepticism. "Based on what savage superstition?" The courtroom erupted. Apache families shouted in their language. Others called for order. Morrison's gavel hammered repeatedly. Into the chaos, Thomas stood. He moved with the slow dignity of age to stand beside Kai, and when he spoke in Apache, the room fell silent, not from understanding but from the sheer weight of authority in his voice. Kai translated. "He says the land, mister, Blackwood wants to dig up contains the bones of our ancestors. warriors who defended their families, mothers who raised children in a world that gave them no mercy, elders who carried stories back to when time itself was young. He says we buried them with ceremony, with love, with the belief that even in death they deserve dignity, and now white men want to scatter them like trash because the earth around them glows. Superstition, Thornton repeated, but with less confidence. Is it superstition to honor your dead? Kai asked. Do white people not build cemeteries, erect headstones, visit graves, or is respect for the deceased only savage when brown skin shows it? Before Thornton could respond, the courtroom doors opened. A figure entered, moving with purpose through the crowd. Professor Edwin Hartley, the archaeologist Daniel had hired years ago, arrived with a leather satchel that appeared to contain the weight of worlds. "Your Honor," Hartley said, slightly breathless, "I apologize for my tardiness. I came as quickly as I could from my post in Washington upon hearing of these proceedings." Morrison frowned. "And you are?" "Professor Edwin Hartley, Smithsonian Institution. I was hired by Daniel Calloway in 1882 to conduct archaeological survey of the property in question. I have documentation that may be relevant to this case." Blackwood's face went white, then red. "This is irregular. This witness was not disclosed." "Because I did not know he existed until this moment," Hartwell said, finding his voice. "Your Honor, I request permission to hear Professor Hartley's testimony." Morrison considered. "Objection noted but overruled. The court is interested in all relevant evidence. Professor, approach and be sworn." What followed was a revelation that changed everything. Hartley presented a comprehensive archaeological report documenting the Calloway property and surrounding lands. Pottery fragments carbon dated to the 1600s. Burial patterns consistent with Apache funerary practices. Most damning evidence of multiple sites of cultural significance that predated any white settlement by centuries. "In my professional opinion," Hartley concluded, "the sites in question are among the most significant Apache archaeological remains in the territory. To excavate them for mineral extraction would be an irreplaceable loss to our understanding of pre-colonial southwestern culture." "This is about rocks and bones," Blackwood burst out, unable to contain himself. "Not culture, not history. Minerals that could bring prosperity to this territory." "At what cost?" Hartley asked quietly. "What is prosperity built on desecrated graves worth?" Morrison called for a recess. 2 hours while he reviewed Hartley's documentation, the photographs Miguel had taken, the testimonies and counter-testimonies that had painted a picture far more complex than a simple property dispute. Kai stood outside the courthouse, surrounded by her unlikely coalition: Thomas, Miguel, Sarah, Elena Weller. The Apache families whose presence had transformed this from a legal proceeding into a referendum on what kind of territory, what kind of nation they wanted to be. "Whatever happens," she said to them, "thank you for standing with me, for refusing to look away, for believing that justice might still matter." "Do you think we will win?" Miguel asked. Kai looked at the boy who had grown so much in such a short time. "I think we have already won something. We have made them see us, made them acknowledge that we exist, that we matter, that our dead deserve the same respect as theirs. Whether the judge rules in our favor is almost secondary to that." But when they returned to the courtroom, when Morrison took his seat and the room fell silent, Kai felt her heart hammer against her ribs. Almost secondary was not the same as unimportant. "I have reviewed the evidence," Morrison began, "both the legal arguments and the archaeological documentation. This case presents a conflict between established territorial law and federal statute regarding treatment of native cultural sites." He paused, and Kai knew with sudden certainty that he was a man genuinely struggling with competing obligations. The Indian Appropriations Act, as cited by Mr. Blackwood's counsel, does classify natives as federal wards in many circumstances. However, it also contains specific exemptions for those who have legally married citizens and established permanent residence outside tribal lands. Mrs. Calloway meets these criteria. Kai felt something loosen in her chest, but Morrison was not finished. "However, the larger issue is not Mrs. Calloway's ownership, but the nature of the land itself. Professor Hartley's documentation, combined with photographic evidence of ongoing excavation, suggests that significant archaeological sites are being destroyed for commercial purposes. This violates federal guidelines regarding protection of historical remains. Morrison looked directly at Blackwood. "Mr. Blackwood, did you have authorization from any federal agency to excavate these sites?" "The land is territorial, not federal," Blackwood said stiffly. "I needed no such authorization." "You are incorrect. Any site containing remains or artifacts predating territorial organization falls under federal jurisdiction regarding preservation. You have been operating illegally." The courtroom erupted again. Morrison let it continue for a moment before gaveling for silence. "My ruling is as follows. The territorial court order seizing Mrs. Calloway's property is overturned as improperly obtained. The property remains in her legal possession. Furthermore, I am issuing an immediate injunction against any excavation or mineral extraction on said property or adjacent lands pending full federal archaeological survey. Mr. Blackwood, you and your company are ordered to cease all operations and restore as much as possible any sites you have disturbed." Blackwood surged to his feet. "This is an outrage. I have rights, legal claims, investments. You have demonstrated a callous disregard for federal law and basic human decency," Morrison said coldly. "Be grateful I am not holding you in contempt or referring this matter to federal prosecutors for criminal charges. This court is adjourned." The gavel fell with the finality of a door closing on an old world and opening on something new, something uncertain, but at least possible. Kai sat motionless as chaos erupted around her. She had won. Not completely, not perfectly, but enough. Her land remained hers. The graves would be protected. Blackwood's schemes had been exposed and stopped. But it was Thomas who reminded her that victory, even deserved victory, was never the end. "He will not accept this," the old man said quietly. "Men like Blackwood do not surrender because a judge tells them to." And Thomas was right. 3 days later, as Kai rode back toward her ranch with her coalition trailing behind, they found smoke rising from the direction of her property. Not the smoke of cooking fires or controlled burning, the black choking smoke of destruction. They arrived to find the ranch house engulfed in flames. The barn collapsed into glowing embers. Fences torn down, water troughs overturned, every improvement Daniel had made reduced to ash and ruin. And standing at the property line just beyond legal reach sat Victor Blackwood on his horse. Watching, making sure Kai saw him, saw what he was capable of when the law failed to serve his purposes. Weller's hand went to his gun, but Kai stopped him. "No, that is what he wants. An excuse to claim self-defense, to paint us as the aggressors." "So we do nothing?" Weller asked, rage barely contained. "We rebuild," Kai said, looking at the smoking ruin that had been her home. "We rebuild and we document what he has done, and we make sure everyone knows that Victor Blackwood is a man who burns homes when he cannot steal them legally." Miguel was crying silent tears, cutting tracks through the soot on his face. Sarah stood frozen in horror. Even the Apache families who had seen so much loss seemed shaken by the casual viciousness of the destruction. But Thomas smiled an expression that held no humor but something harder. "They burn our homes thinking fire can erase us. They have been trying this for 200 years, and yet we persist. We rebuild, we remember, and we refuse to disappear." That night they camped on the land where Kai's house had stood. No shelter, no walls, just open sky and the smell of burning wood. But as darkness fell, Apache families began to sing. Not mourning songs this time, songs of resilience, songs that acknowledged pain without surrendering to it. And as they sang, something remarkable happened. Neighbors arrived, not just Sarah's father grudgingly admitting that Kai had been wronged, but families from town, Mexican and white and mixed, carrying timber and tools and food, people who had stayed silent during the legal battle but could not stomach this naked cruelty. "We will help you rebuild," one rancher said gruffly, "not because we agree with you about everything, but because a man who burns another's home deserves to be opposed." By dawn, The foundation of a new house had been laid. Rough timber was being shaped into walls. Women who had never spoken to Kai before worked beside Apache grandmothers cooking food for the laborers, their children playing together in the dust. Kai stood watching this impossible gathering, this coalition built not on perfect understanding, but on shared recognition that some lines could not be crossed without consequences. Weller approached carrying 2 cups of coffee. "You did it," he said simply. "You made them see." "Daniel did it," Kai replied. "He bought this land knowing what it was, knowing what it represented. He left me the tools I needed. I just used them." "No," Weller said. "Daniel gave you opportunity, but you chose to fight. That was not him. That was you." 3 weeks later, as the new house stood half-finished but habitable, another visitor arrived. Deputy Marshal Cord, looking uncomfortable and carrying documents. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, "I am here to inform you that federal charges have been filed against Victor Blackwood. Arson, destruction of federal archaeological sites, bribery of territorial officials. He will stand trial in federal court." Kai accepted this news with less satisfaction than she had expected. Justice, when it finally arrived, felt less like victory than like the ending of something that should never have begun. "Will he be convicted?" she asked. "I do not know," Cord admitted. "He has resources, connections. But at least he will face consequences. That is more than men like him usually do." After Cord left, Kai stood holding the documents, their official seals promising a justice she had learned not to trust easily. 6 months later, the news reached Coyote Springs in a Santa Fe newspaper. The headline read, "Mining Baron Convicted in Federal Court. Victor Blackwood guilty on all counts. 5 years in territorial prison." The Arizona Mining Company dissolved its assets, seized to pay damages. His appeals denied. The photographs Miguel had taken, the testimonies of Apache elders, the archaeological evidence, all of it too overwhelming for even expensive lawyers to dismiss. Kai read the article on her porch and felt no triumph. Only quiet acknowledgement that sometimes rarely justice moved as it should, that sometimes the powerful faced consequences, that sometimes resistance mattered. She brought the newspaper to Thomas, who was teaching Chato to weave a basket. The old man read it slowly. "Is it enough?" he asked in their language. "It has to be," Kai replied. Thomas nodded and returned to his weaving. Some victories were measured not in satisfaction but in continuation. The ability to keep teaching, keep building, keep existing. Kai looked across her land. The half-built house would be finished by winter. The small Apache community was taking root. Blackwood was in prison, his company destroyed. But that was not the victory that mattered. The victory was this: they remained. They built. They taught the next generation. They refused to disappear. And that would outlast any prison sentence. She returned to where Thomas sat on the porch of the half-built house, teaching Chato and Miguel words in Apache, passing on language that schools had tried to erase. "Is it enough?" she asked him in their language. "The house will be rebuilt, the land is ours, but nothing really changes, does it? Next year, next decade, there will be another Blackwood, another scheme to take what is ours." Thomas looked at her with ancient eyes. "You are asking the wrong question. Not whether enemies will continue to come. They will. The question is whether our people will continue to resist. And because of you, because of what you have shown is possible, the answer is yes." He gestured at the Apache families who had stayed, who were building small houses on the edges of Kai's property with her permission. A community forming in defiance of laws that said they should not exist outside reservations. You have given them something more valuable than legal victory. You have given them hope, the knowledge that resistance is possible, that they do not have to accept erasure quietly. As evening fell, Kai stood on her land and looked toward the canyon where her ancestors slept, where glowing stones still rested in earth, protected now by federal order, but more importantly by the knowledge that people were watching, that desecration would not go unnoticed. She thought of Daniel, of the choice he had made to buy this land to marry an Apache woman, despite the cost to prepare for a future he would not live to see. She thought of her father Naichi, who had died defending his family with the same fierce love she now felt for this impossible piece of earth. And she thought of herself, not the frightened girl pulled from fire, not the Indian school student taught to be ashamed, not even the widow struggling to survive, but something new, a woman who had found her voice in the language of the oppressor and used it to defend what the oppressed held sacred. Miguel approached carrying something wrapped in cloth. "Senora Thomas said you should have this. He said your grandmother made it." Kai unwrapped the cloth to find a woven basket intricately patterned, the kind of work that took months to complete. Inside was a note in Thomas's careful hand. "For carrying seeds, for planting, for growing things that last beyond one season." She looked at the half-built house at the Apache families constructing their own shelters, at the coalition of unlikely allies who had stood with her. This was not ending. This was beginning. The land remained hers, not because the law finally protected her, but because she had refused to let it be taken. The graves remained protected not because officials cared about Apache dead, but because she had made the cost of desecration too high to ignore. It was not perfect justice. It was not complete victory. But it was survival with dignity. It was resistance that mattered. It was the knowledge that her people, her land, her heritage would persist not in museums or history books, but in living memory, in continued presence, in stubborn refusal to disappear. As the sun set over the Arizona desert, painting sky and earth in colors that existed nowhere else, Kai Nashoba Calloway stood on land. Her ancestors had walked land, her husband had protected land. She would defend for whatever came next. The moon rose full and bright, illuminating the canyon where starstones still rested in earth. And if you knew how to listen, you could hear the land itself remembering, honoring, promising that some things would endure long after empires crumbled and laws changed and men like Blackwood were forgotten. She was Apache. She was widow. She was warrior who had won not through violence but through the more difficult courage of standing visible when invisibility would have been safer. And she was home. Not the home that had burned, not the home that could be destroyed by fire or stolen by law, but the deeper home of knowing who she was, what she defended, why it mattered. In the darkness, Thomas began to sing. Others joined. Their voices rose to meet the moon, carrying stories that would not be silenced, memories that would not be erased, a people who refused to be past tense. And Kai sang with them, her voice finding harmonies she had forgotten she knew, reclaiming language they had tried to beat out of her, becoming once again and forever the daughter of Naiche, keeper of sacred ground, bridge between worlds, proof that survival was not surrender. The night embraced them all, witness and promise, ending and beginning woven together like the patterns in her grandmother's basket. Where the moon touched earth, the people remembered, and that in the end was everything.